Hey everybody, Joe here from the Lions Led by Donkeys podcast. If you enjoy what we do here on the show and you think it's worth your hard-earned money, you can support the show via Patreon. Just a $1 donation gets you access to bonus episodes, our Discord, and regular episodes before everybody else. If you donate at an elevated level, you get even more bonus content. A digital copy of my book, The Hooligans of Kandahar, and a sticker from our Teespring store. Our show will always be ad-free and is totally supporter-driven. We use that money to pay our bills, buy research materials that make this show possible, and support charities like the Kurdish Red Crescent, the Flint Water Fund, and the Halo Trust. Consider joining the Legion of the Old Crow today. And now back to the show.
Solidarity forever.
And me still not knowing what I'm doing. This is a great cold opening, so everybody sees like the behind the scenes of how incompetent I am and how much our producer saves my fucking ass.
You're going to have to do a third Cadorna-ing.
No more Cadorna. At this point, I am just going to decimate myself. So, hello. Welcome to yet another episode of the Lions Led by Donkeys podcast. I'm Joe. And with me today is labor attorney and part-time labor historian when I need him to be, Carrie Shockey. What up, dude?
Recording here from my secret location. As I sit here in quarantine. I mean, thankfully, a little bit more comfortable than when Nick had to do it, I think. But
yeah, probably.
Because I'm not just getting like a food tray of whatever scraps came from like the from the chow hall, like every 24 hours.
You're now the third person who's recorded on the show while in quarantine. Myself, Nick, and now you. Congratulations. We have a hat trick for COVID.
We just thought, there was someone, was it like a month ago now? Someone created that account that was specifically just saying that they really fucking hated the sound of your voice until they heard mine, and that was even worse.
As someone who has to hear my own voice, I also hate my voice, which is why I don't edit my own podcast.
Right. Yeah, and I've never listened. It's actually a pain in the ass that I've been on so many episodes because now, every so often I won't be paying attention, and my podcast app will go to a new episode. It'll be me on it, and I have to recoil away in fucking horror.
Hey, at least it's not the genocide one. I know people have been sending me messages regarding why Nick has not been on the show. No, Nick has not been fired. I don't think I legally one of us could fire the other one. And we are both members of the IWW, so I feel like there's a grievance procedure at play. But he's moving, and it requires him to get internet. And he will be back on the show whenever that is possible. So, yeah, I miss him too. He'll be back. I just want him back. God damn it.
Feel like shit. Just want him back.
And this is a disclaimer. I understand this is a military history podcast, and we will be talking about military history. However, we'll be talking a lot about labor history today and a guy named Eugene V. Debs. So it's gonna be a very political episode. I know sometimes, somehow, the political stance in this show is kind of, unknown to some listeners. But we're all different shades of leftist on this show. Spoiler alert. So we're going to be talking about something that me and Carrie both are really interested in. And again, after 4 weeks of genocide episodes, I kind of just want to talk about something I want to talk about.
Just allow Joe can have something that isn't like a war crime as a treat.
I mean, unfortunately, there's crimes against humanity in this.
Yeah, well, fewer war crimes,
significantly fewer, and many people are saying this, and a lot less people die, at least.
Unfortunately, no one tastes themselves in the nuts, but
No, I don't think a taser had been invented yet. But yeah, if you're someone who comes to listen to just stuff about military battles, this episode probably won't be for you, but maybe it will be. And maybe it'll be turned on to one of the most successful left-wing politicians in American history. And labor organizers, for that matter.
Which is admittedly not a broad category.
No, it's a very, very short list of people. And I promise this will have something to do with military history. So stick around. You might learn something.
God forbid.
So, Shocks, I wrote the script for somebody else. Admittedly, because like normally I have a co-host, and it starts off with, "Have you ever heard of Eugene V. Debs?" And I'm willing to bet that answer is yes for you.
Yeah. It's I'm actually I'm enough of a nerd that I was actually like a pretty young little like leftist, which it actually makes me really happy that Twitter wasn't around the time that I was 13, because I probably would have been like an insufferable fucking tangy for at least some of it. But
Whomst amongst us, am I right?
yeah. I mean, it's definitely like I'm glad that my little commie like live journal postings from like 2002 don't exist anymore. But yeah, no, I mean,
I got suspended from school for running as student body president as a communist.
oh really? Yeah,
So, yeah.
I actually won an election for office when I was in high school by doing a parody version of Khrushchev's speech. Was it the kitchen speech or whatever, where he slams his shoe on the table?
Oh yeah.
So, but I mean, I guess that's just growing up in communist Massachusetts. So, I definitely know who Eugene Debs is. He's not one of my he's not one of my favorite of the American leftists, but he's definitely like someone who just kind of, even I feel like in some history books that are a little bit more mainstream, he just kind of pops up often enough that he's probably someone who like might have been on your radar if you didn't sleep your entire way through history class.
That's my brand. That's the only class I didn't sleep through. And I mean, like I already said, and maybe someone thought I was joking, I am a member of the IWW, so my thoughts on Debs are probably a little bit stilted. But I do try to call it my biases when I notice them. And I didn't learn about him in grade school. I did learn about him a lot in college. And because I took a history of American labor movement class, which was fucking outstanding. It was probably one of my favorite classes, and a lot of it was Debs. And I think we'll talk about this a little bit later. I think he would not like how famous he is, for one.
Yeah,
and for two, I think he is a creature of circumstance, and that is, if Woodrow Wilson didn't fucking hate him so much, history would have forgotten about him.
Yeah, I mean, and it's difficult too, because I feel like it's one of those things where he kind of existed during. He was not a particularly colorful character compared to a lot of his contemporaries, and
he's a very normal guy who could just speak well.
Yeah, and he didn't really I'm sure he did some writing, but he's not really known as having developed a lot on his own necessarily.
He wrote one book while he was in prison.
Yeah, he was kind of, in a way, like very much like kind of a yeoman of the labor left during the late 1800s and early 1900s, and which is kind of interesting because he's not someone anyone's ever going to make a movie about, because it'll put everyone to sleep over 3 hours.
Also, it would be very hard to find an actor who looks like him, because he kind of looks like a turtle, but not in the Mitch McConnell way.
An elegant turtle.
I think, yeah, he was a damn fine turtle. I like Eugene V. Debs' story because it's a very, very normal story, in my opinion, and I think that's why it makes it so interesting. So, Eugene Victor Debs was born November 5th, 1855 in Terre Haute, Indiana. And I don't know if I pronounced that city right. Terre Haute.
I mean, I've been to...
It's where the federal death penalty is now. I know that.
Yeah, exactly. Because every time anyone's been put to death in the last 6 months, you get to hear like headlines from Terre Haute to...
Terre Haute.
Terry Hatcher.
Yeah.
I've been to Indiana twice, and I can't recommend it either way, so...
Yeah, shout out to Indiana for making the news in the worst way possible. So he was born to French immigrant parents. I believe they're from Alsace. Certainly nothing bad would happen to that region anytime soon.
Nope.
And his family was actually very wealthy once upon a time, but it was way before Eugene Debs was born. But by the time he was born, they were pretty much destitute. So like he would hear stories from like his dad about back in the day, when we had money. So, and like Eugene Debs is like, I'm having a turnip for dinner again. I really don't care about the old country. And like it was very common for kids of the lower class back in the day, and depending on where you live today, also today, you're kind of expected to drop out of school and get a job in order to help provide for the family. I also had to do that, though I managed to not drop out. So I was able to balance my shitty job when I was 14 and 15 and also my shitty high school. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that my high school didn't really care if I turned anything in and they would still pass me. But Debs dropped out of school when he was 14 to get a job. And it was super common, like paper boys and things like that. And this is like, child labor is still totally legal.
Yeah.
So,
not only legal, but like, essentially like a key component of the economic system at that point.
Yeah, it's 100% good and fine, actually, to have 5-year-olds shoving their hands into machinery. When he was 14, he left high school and began working in the railroads. A sector or a work sector that would pretty much define his entire life. He began his job cleaning grease from tracks, which was a job I was not aware existed.
And sounds miserable. As someone who's just cleaned grease from a trap in a bakery, that's bad enough. I can only imagine that doing it in a fucking rail yard is probably not a lot of fun.
I've had to deal with industrial grease on tanks because there's a lot of it. Like it keeps track tension and things like that. And whenever it explodes and gets everywhere, it's disgusting.
Oh yeah,
I can imagine it's that hard to clean up. I assume 14-year-old Eugene Debs worked much harder than I did while I was in the Army, though. Terrible work ethic.
We had it too from the particularly when I worked on a little buoy tender. And so we had to like grease all the wire rope and like, everything else there. And we had to use something that we used to call Smurf jizz, because it was just like, it was like literally the color of a fucking Smurf. And you just have to like scoop it out with your hands with like a, glove on and like use that to grease the wire rope. So I can't imagine it was fun.
Yeah. And he made about 50 cents a day doing this. And I found a conversion rate for over the years. And, 50, you're like, oh, well, 50 cents a day in the 1800s must have been pretty good. That's actually about $10 a day for some very hard physical labor for a 14-year-old child. So it's not good, even for then. But
well, he just needs a side gig, right?
Yeah, he just needs to work for fucking, I don't know, carriage Uber. To be fair, this was considered much better than some shitty child jobs of the day. You could certainly make worse money, but that doesn't mean it's good.
Right.
But it was the mid 1800s, and Debs didn't exactly have a lot of options open to him. Like he couldn't like quit and get a better job. This is the best thing he could hope for. So he kept working, and eventually he got promoted to painting the trains, which honestly sounds like shit, but it does sound better than cleaning up grease. But he eventually hit pay dirt when one of the train's firemen showed up to work drunk and got fired. So they promoted Debs to his position.
Been there, I mean.
Yeah, I've been promoted dumber ways, I guess.
Yeah.
Now, a fireman isn't like, you call 911 and a fireman shows up. It's the guy who shoveled coal into a steam engine. It's a much harder and more dangerous job than anything he had done before. So in case people are unaware, sometimes boilers fucking explode if you didn't do the job correctly. And sometimes they exploded even when you did do it correctly.
Yeah. And this is like an era before like, there's like any sort of like workers' comp, which I think really only started in like you get some forms of it kind of in the mid 1800s, but like it was not very prevalent at the time that Debs was working. Tort law was also like not really what you would expect. So essentially, like if you died on the job, it was just like, oh well, that sucks.
Find us a new boy.
Yeah, like oh, let's blew this one up. Better just like scrape him off and get a new one.
And that's like he was part of the Firemen's Union, which was the first union he was a part of, and that's like at bare minimum is what they did. Is like if you died, they'd give your family money.
Yeah,
but. His job is terrible, but it did double his pay immediately, so that's good. So he worked his way up to that firemen's union, and eventually worked his way up to he was like the Grand Treasury, and then he did do a single term in the Indiana General Assembly as a Democrat. But this is like early 1900s Democrats now.
Yeah, which was not great.
No.
I mean, like these are, the rest of your party is essentially just everyone down south who just recently got their right to like vote and hold office, back, or actually probably at that point not even, because Reconstruction was still going on. So like
the guys you're working with probably own slaves.
Yeah, like 100%.
But this is Debs the younger, and at this point, Debs is absolutely not the person he'd go down his history as. Now, at the time, rail unions were much different than what we would think of when we think of rail unions in the 1900s, and especially what we think of unions in general today. For example, they are not really a method of collective bargaining. In fact, the concept of collective bargaining was illegal.
Yep. You are forming an illegal combination and restraint of trade.
Yeah. They were pretty much a hangout, like an Eagles club or something, where dudes could like ditch out of ignore it, without hanging out with their families and hang out with their fellow rail workers after work. This is the organization that Debs rose up within. Just for an example, the union's motto is benevolence, sobriety, and industry.
Yeah, it was more of like some sort of like Horatio Alger bootstraps shit, combined with a drinking club. The idea that any sort of union that would actually be legal was still very much an unconventional concept. And there's no, federal labor law is still 50 years away in the 30s. So, and particularly with railroads, you're going against guys who just have all the fucking power in the world. So,
right. And not to mention the time that he is coming up in is Standard Oil was just created and, commands an incredible amount of power. There's Pacific Rail and things like that. So he is born right in the heyday of American oligarchs and titans of industry, as I too kindly call them sometimes.
Yeah. And I mean, this is an era where antitrust law really hasn't been developed yet, in a real way. I mean, you kind of have the rise of these first capitalist barons, which are, the rich people we see today really didn't exist, in the same vein in the U.S. until this period. And it was a period of just extreme inequality, where you have these guys just, you have a lot of the magnates of industry just kind of cornering the market in various different ways. And everyone else is just, as you said, he was still only earning about $10 a day for an entire day's worth of what I assume to be backbreaking work.
It was 16 to 18 hours a day.
Yeah. I mean, it was an era without any employment regulation whatsoever, any labor regulation whatsoever. And just, and extreme boom and bust cycles is the other big part of that.
Yeah, and that's one of the things we'll talk about when he gets to striking.
Yeah, and throughout this whole period, even more than the past 10 years, you would just have absolute bank collapses every 3 to 5 years or so. And so you just have, periods of relative prosperity, and then just, kind of, as Joe was saying earlier, as you were saying earlier about that his family did have money at one point, and then had about a turnip between them towards the time that he was born. I mean, yeah. that kind of that was pretty common. You could gain and lose fortunes really fucking quick.
Thankfully, that doesn't happen anymore.
Right. Yeah. Anyway, everyone just hear that Tesla's now worth more than the other 12 top car makers in the world combined.
Yeah, I can't wait until he invents Mars apartheid.
Yeah.
If he does, I'm going to actually have to sue him because I put that in a sci-fi novel, and I did not mean for it to become a reality. Just to underline how different Debs is at this point in his life than what he'd come up to be, he said, quote, labor and capital are friends.
Yeah.
And he also didn't think strikes were a good idea. However, like most socialists or people who'd become leftists in some flavor or another, Debs arrived at radical ideas out of his experiences operating within capitalism. Of course, the railways really liked unions the way that they were. That is, not having collective bargaining powers and only kind of paying out death benefits if you get blown up on your shitty made boiler. And it gave gifts and favors to the union leadership to make sure the union stayed that way. Now, I don't mean to say that Debs was a sellout. He wasn't. He was just naive. He thought if the powers of capital saw how hard he worked and how hard his fellow laborers worked, they'd be treated fairly and paid well. Another one of the reasons he took the path at first is because, remember, collective bargaining wasn't a thing. And every time you tried to collectively bargain, the state would use horrible violence to try to make sure you couldn't. This included Pinkertons, the National Guard, random dudes with guns, just strike breakers.
Yeah, just militia.
You would be killed.
Yeah. And like quickly, and like maybe also your family.
Yeah, so like it was a hell of a step to be like, no, we should, collectively bargain, because you will have violence visited upon. It's not a matter of how many of you they're going to kill. It's like, when does it start?
Yeah.
Because for fuck's sake, during a miners' union strike, they were planning to drop bombs on them with fucking Air Force planes.
Yeah.
This is no fucking joke.
Yeah. And I mean, if it's even more than now, I mean, we've all been obsessed with, Jimmy, the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa for like fucking 60 years now. Just about, 50 years. But just having your union leader, or like even just a guy who spoke up at work just disappear on a regular basis, particularly in, some of the company towns that various different, industrial powers would set up. I mean, you would just disappear, or just end up in a ditch. Maybe you're like, hung from a street light as a warning to others. I mean, all sorts of shit like that.
It's the implication.
Right.
Now, as anybody who has ever taken a class or a look at early American industrial history, or I don't know, had a job at one point in your life, could have told Debs that licking the company boots probably wouldn't get him or his workers what they needed, or what they thought they needed. This led the Firemen's Union and Debs to authorize the first strike in the union's history in 1888. Unfortunately, the Burlington strike was a complete failure, but it did lead Debs to learn some things. And that is to understand craft workers should unionize together, not along specific job lines. So what happened during the Burlington strike was like he was in the Firemen's Union. Specifically, only firemen could be part of that union, the coal shovelers. They allied with other very specific unions. But what the company did, instead of caving to union demands, divide and conquer. They bribed the other unions to strike break for them.
Yeah.
Whoops. So he started the American Railway Union. Holy shit, I can't read. Which was America's first ever industrial union. That means everyone who works in a rail yard joins this one union. They can no longer be divided and conquered into the firemen and the brakemen or whatever. Now you have to deal with everybody in a united front. And together, in 1894, they did another strike with the Great Northern Railway, and they won concessions for the workers. One of the things is like grievances. Something that simple. Like, holy shit, we can actually complain about our bosses. And like, death benefits and things like that. These aren't people like demanding $50 an hour. They're like, we would rather not die at work, please.
Yeah, I'd like not to be used as fuel after I collapse on the job.
Yeah, and if you die in the job, they actually just use you for track grease.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I'd like not to be melted down, please, in my, in my death.
Yeah, and this led to probably the second biggest thing that Debs is known for. That is the Pullman strike of 1894. The Pullman strike took place in the Pullman Palace Car Company, which is a very fancy name for a company that made train cars. But for upper class people who were traveling,
literal coach building.
Yeah. So there was a boom, Shocks talk about, and then there was a bust. So they built a ton of cars for this company, and then there was the bust came when they made fucking too many of them. This, of course, led to the biggest thing that Debs is known for, the Pullman strike. Now, the Pullman strike took place against the Pullman Palace Car Company, which is the palace is in the name. They built literal coach cars, but they're like upper class coach cars. And like Shocks talked about, there's a boom and then there's a bust. So they built too many goddamn cars, and then they had to cut wages in order to make up for the losses because they couldn't sell anymore. Unfortunately, when they cut wages for its workers, in order to work for the Pullman Palace Car Company, you had to live in, drumroll please, the Pullman Palace Company town and live in Pullman Palace Company housing and shop at Pullman Palace Company stores. So when they cut wages for the workers, they did not cut prices of any of the things within the company town. So it effectively made them homeless and destitute while working full time.
Perfect.
Now, this is the problem. I think maybe the first time we've ever talked about company script or company towns in this show. So I'll go over it a little bit. So bear with me for a bit if you already know. So during this time, especially in places like mines or rail yards, it was not uncommon for workers to be paid in company script, not money. Think of it as monopoly money. The script could be spent only in company towns and like company-owned stores, effectively creating their own really fucked up economy with the money going right back to the company, effectively creating their own industrial fiefdom that the workers couldn't leave because their money was in train bucks or whatever.
Which is in particular, the reason why you see it in mining in particular is because obviously a lot of mining was done in areas where, just because of where the mine was set up, you wouldn't already have a lot of other infrastructure. So, you essentially had, unless you wanted to try, to travel like 20 miles away by, fucking horse, there was nowhere else that you could really do your shopping. So, you were the company used your immobility against you to, force you to shop in their stores.
Yeah. And you couldn't leave because your whole life savings is in, coal dollars.
And because you're probably working, like 6.5 days a week or something.
Yeah. And sometimes the companies would pay people in real money, but then force them to live in company housing, effectively laundering the money right back to themselves bit by bit. And I think that was the case with Pullman, is that they paid people actual wages, but then forced them to live in company housing.
Yeah.
So they cut their real wages, but then didn't cut their rent. And that ended up being the step too far after being fucked over for years.
If that seems familiar to you, it's because it's essentially what we've been doing in the United States for the last 6 months. So, get ready for that.
Yeah, thankfully there hasn't been any social upheaval at all.
Yeah. No, things have been really fucking normal this week.
Yeah. Yep. Totally good and fine. Now, the strike worked to an extent. They made alliances with other unions that covered other parts of the railway and effectively crippled the national transportation system. And then, rather than be like, maybe these people have a point, maybe we should talk to them and pay them fairly and treat them like human beings, the government called in thousands of cops, soldiers, and strike breakers who were deployed to crush the strike. And it was broken by force, killing 13 people. Eugene Debs was in the middle of all of this, and it was a radicalizing moment for him, who prior to this would never have called himself a socialist, just a normal dude who wanted to live a decent life. This is from Eugene Debs wrote this in 1902. Quote, "The combined corporations were paralyzed and helpless. At this juncture, they were delivered in wholly unexpected quarters, a swift succession of blows that blinded me for an instant and then opened wide my eyes. And the gleam of every bayonet and flashes every rifle, the class struggle was revealed. This is my first practical lesson in socialism, though wholly unaware it was called that by name."
Yeah. I mean,
so good job, cops.
Well, I mean, there's the apocryphal phrase, like, you get the union that, employers get the union that they deserve. And, you have to imagine that the chief, the legal instrument that's at work here is injunctions. And so the way that, the law would function during this period is that employers were allowed to get injunctions to stop strikes. So even now, as shitty as our labor law is, you can't actually force. I mean, you can economically try to starve folks out, but you can't just force them back to work through the power of an injunction. There are public sector limitations to that, but I mean, in general, most labor law has an anti-injunction, provision. At least for private sector.
The injunction's very weird. It's like the judge said you have to stop striking now.
Yeah.
Otherwise you're committing a felony. Like, well, that's dumb. Why would I listen to that?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, that was the kind of legal tool that they would use to then, call in, troops and, essentially force folks back to work at the point of a bayonet, if not a bullet.
Sometimes both.
Right.
So while now a self-described socialist, Debs was also arrested and thrown in prison on federal charges due to the strike. He was charged with a few things. One of them was the injunction, but the other one was mail obstruction due to the fact that several of the trains that the strike had held up had also included federal mail. So, yeah, just trying to tack things on. Though times are much different, and he only served 6 months. During this time in jail, his politics only went further and further to the left. People were sending him just endless amounts of books and theory, which he read constantly. And he realized kind of like what he wanted to do when he got out. Though he still stayed true to just talking to people that they're human and how to better themselves in their material conditions rather than screaming theory at them. Might be a good idea.
Nah.
So when he got out, he formed the Socialist Party. There's a few other things before that, but I'm going to skip ahead a bit. There was, I think there's the Democratic Progressives or something stupid like that, but eventually morphed into the Socialist Party. And then he began running for president pretty much all the time.
Yeah. He was the kind of the Ralph Nader of the late 1800s.
But I think he actually did better.
Yeah. I mean, he was more of a legitimate, he was probably a more legitimate candidate at that point than Ralph ever was, or the Green Party in general ever has been.
Yeah, I think he won more votes than the Green Party did this year, I think.
Yeah.
Or last year, rather. Now, obviously, we know he didn't win, but he was one of the most successful third-party candidates of all time, and certainly the most successful candidate from any party calling itself socialist. In one case, he came in second place in Florida, ahead of eventual President William Howard Taft and former President Teddy Roosevelt. And he was winning 5 to 9% of the popular vote.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I know the population's much smaller, but goddamn.
Well, and part of it too, in certain states you have to think is just due to the, kind of immigrant population that come over from Europe, that, where all these ideas were treated as just kind of like a normal part of the political spectrum, even if it was something that they got, forced to flee their fucking country over. But it was at least, something that, folks were talking about. And, most major cities at this point would have like a socialist newspaper or something to put out ideas. And, it was kind of, there was this entire kind of ecosystem that is, hard to imagine now in comparison.
Yeah. During this time, a lot of people in the Socialist Party did get elected to things like, the House,
Yeah, or Milwaukee.
One guy in New York was in the House of Representatives as a member of the Socialist Party of America, which is crazy to think about now. But yeah,
and I mean there was Wisconsin in particular, had a fairly active socialist movement for a long time, and I think the mayor of Milwaukee was a socialist. It was not. It was something that probably was not repeated really until the last, I would say, 10 years when you started to see folks from DSA start to run for things.
And even then, most of the time, this is members of the Democratic Party. They're not running as socialists.
Yeah.
Which is very weird. And I mean, obviously, we all know why that's the case. So during the same time, he also helped start the Industrial Workers of the World, or the IWW, sometimes known as the Wobblies, which I am a member of. And certainly nothing bad happened to members of the Wobblies simply for being socialists. No. Centralia. It was really weird, as a member of the IWW in Washington and someone who lived 30 minutes away from the Centralia massacre, where members of the IWW were shot by members of the American Legion for being socialist.
Yeah.
That every single year on the anniversary, they just argue over who's at fault. It's been 100 years, guys.
Yeah. One, I know that the local Wobblies show up every year and do a commemoration, which is nice.
Oh yeah. The American Legion is fucking toxic. We've talked about them before, and they're mostly the problem here.
Yeah, and I mean, kind of have been through history. I mean, even subsequent VSOs that have opened up have generally opened up because their members didn't want to join the American Legion.
Yeah, or the VFW, who's I don't know if they're any better.
I don't think any of them are great at this point, but I mean, that's just
no. Another 10 years, they'll all be died out because it's just full of old dudes.
Yeah.
So unfortunately for America and, all of humanity, it was during this time that a little shindig called World War I started. Long story short, some inbred people were beefing over turf and tens of millions of people died as a direct result. And it's bad.
Just taking a really bold stance here.
Yeah, World War I, bad actually.
Yeah, it turns out. Looked into it and not great.
Yeah. Turns out no wars are really necessary. Weird. But at first, America stayed out of it. In 1914, Debs joined thousands of other Americans demanding that America keep its policy of neutrality firmly in place. And that is kind of what happened at first. At the start of World War I, most of America held Debs' anti-war beliefs at the time, though not his socialist critique of the war. But that was something he's like, you know what? Close enough. Fine. Debs believed that the war was between the ruling classes of nations, that the working class shouldn't have anything to do with it. He said, quote, "I know of no reason why the workers should fight for what the capitalists own," Debs wrote to novelist friend Upton Sinclair, "or slaughter one another for countries that belong to their masters." Which, yep.
But I mean, that was still, as well, unfortunately, I have to get into, but I mean, it caused a big split. At first, really more with a lot of the European socialist parties, but whether or not to support nationalism kind of ended up being a wedge issue for a lot of folks during this period.
Yeah, and they was certainly drug along by some government stuff we'll talk about.
Yeah.
Americans' opposition to the war wasn't like, fuck the monarchies and them sending their subjects to their deaths in Europe. It was like, why does this have anything to do with us? Fuck off. Which,
yeah,
also valid.
Well, and it's something that, when you think about the military-industrial complex as really being a creation of World War II, and, this is a period where, with the exception of kind of clashing with European powers, Spain most recently in this particular case, but, the United States was, a lot more of an internally domestically focused, or at least, domestically colonialist, then, we would be able to recognize it today. And there's, very small standing army, no real federal
100,000 people.
Yeah. And even in general, the federal infrastructure, the administrative state was fucking tiny. Washington D.C. was very much still a fucking backwater.
World War I and the development of the American Expeditionary Force that we would send is pretty much the final death throes of federalism.
Yeah.
And it would centralize a lot of military power upon the federal army. But yeah, America is not even considered a military power by anybody except maybe Mexico, because we've already fucked with them a couple times.
Well, and because even really our we hadn't really intervened anywhere in Central America at this point yet, with the exception of Cuba. In the Spanish-American War, we were still using state reserve
volunteer forces.
Yeah, that was what that was the banner under which my great grandfather committed some light war crimes in the Philippines.
I mean, whomst amongst us, am I right?
Yeah, just some light ones.
I believe it was a member of the Nebraska volunteers that started the entire insurrection for the most part.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he shot a random unarmed Philippine soldier.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I mean that about checks out.
While shouting the N-word, because of course he did.
Yeah, because of course he was. Yeah. So.
When I say that America was broadly anti-war at the time, it's mostly guilty of circumstance. The concept that America is going to go fight in a European war is very weird for most Americans, and not to mention we simply lack the military to do so. When we finally do ramp up and start recruiting an army, there's not even enough rifles to go around, and people are training with sticks.
Yeah,
we'll talk a little bit about that too. And while America was neutral, quote unquote, it didn't mean they didn't want to make some money. We were flooding the Allies with supplies, but we did see ourselves as a peacemaker. In that this is still 1914, 1915, very early on in the war. And our goal was to make as much money as possible off loans, of course, but also to try to get the war to stop by bringing all the sides together and to negotiate. But because it's 1914, 1915, and not to mention this wouldn't really matter a few years even in the future from this, every side thought that they could win in short order, so they didn't want to talk peace. So it didn't really work.
Yeah.
This began to change when the Germans blew up the Lusitania. It was a passenger ship and killed hundreds of civilians, and it was framed as a cowardly attack on an unarmed passenger ship, which it was. But the Lusitania is also full of ammunition being brought to Europe to be used against the Germans.
That was definitely one of the biggest things that I think I've learned in the last few years that it was not something that I learned in either middle school or high school. Was that that was definitely the party line was still very much America had to avenge the Lusitania. It's like, no, that was super and if I remember correctly too, Germany definitely either targeted or raided or whatever else several other American ships before that. So it's essentially just a moment of opportunity for Wilson to go to war.
Yeah, it was mostly they had attacked merchant ships, but hence they brought up unrestricted submarine warfare needs to go, blah blah blah. But the Lusitania was very obviously a passenger ship,
yeah,
which is wrong. But you could also say blowing up civilians is bad, but using them as human shields for your war material puts them in that situation. Everybody here sucks. Now, that wasn't exactly what pushed Wilson to war. What did was in 1917 when Germany sent the Zimmermann telegram, urging Mexico to invade the United States. Now, this is hardly realistic for Mexico to do. They were still in the middle of a civil war, not to mention they didn't have the military capacity to do so, and the United States is fucking huge. It's simply not going to work. But it did show that the Germans were totally fine with war against the U.S., and if they managed to defeat the Allies in Europe, after everything the U.S. had done in order to aid their war effort, there's a very good chance Germany would make war against them anyway. Now, there were some debates over whether the telegram was real or not. For instance, when it was presented in U.S. media, it was said we intercepted this, or this was given to us by Mexico or whatever, but in reality it's intercepted by British intelligence and given to us. So that started a conspiracy theory somewhat that the British placed it in order to lure us into the war. But no, that's not what happened. Imperial German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmern admitted a few months later, yeah, I sent that. And this is while they're still at war, yeah, that's my bad, bro.
Whoops.
Now, there's a lot of anti-German sentiment, not to mention a lot of anti-Mexican sentiment, which thankfully America's never had again involved in this. Mostly the fact that, there's already been raids across the border in regards to Pancho Villa on both sides. We've sent entire expeditionary forces to try to hunt them down. Not to mention that I think it's Carranza was in the middle of a civil war at the time.
And I think, all of this area had only become the United States 60 years previously, within a couple generations. So you gotta, you gotta imagine that there's still a lot of bad blood. There's still motherfuckers kicking around who had probably been at the Alamo, or not at the Alamo, but
certainly Mexicans who'd probably been around.
Yeah.
All the Americans get shot.
Yeah. So
sorry, all the Texans. They weren't Americans yet,
or ever.
Slavers, members of a slave rebellion again. So it's weird to think that the fear of a war with Mexico is what drove us to World War I, because it's really not. We weren't realistically afraid that Mexico was going to invade because it wasn't a military reality. It was more of a, okay, I guess Germany fucked around, now they have to find out. It's all very stupid. There's also some writing saying that the U.S. was kind of worried that if they didn't get involved, the British and the French wouldn't be able to pay their loans back.
Yeah, I've also heard of it, being kind of a way to try to consolidate the nation that would, on the part of nativists, just out of promoting nationalism as a way of kind of creating this was just before this kind of second resurgence of the Klan, so there was definitely a lot of kind of trying to create a white identity as we would currently understand it.
Oh yeah, Wilson showed the first ever movie screened in the White House as a KKK movie.
Yeah, The Birth of a Nation. Yeah.
Yep. There's a lot of reasons why the U.S. entered World War One. Wilson also wanted a voice at the negotiation table to push his own agenda, which all failed. So whatever. Anyway, the U.S. found itself in the middle of the war, but it didn't really have an army to go to war with. In the lead up to the entry of World War I, the U.S. pretty much knew they had nothing in regards to an army that could realistically be sent off to Europe in order to fight with its peers and against its enemies there, especially not on the same footing. Even as the start of the war in 1914, the government knew they were fucked if they actually had to get involved. They knew that they wanted a federal army rather than relying on the National Guard and volunteer units like they had done in their war against Spain, which showed themselves terribly. And really the only reason why we won is because the Spanish army is even worse shape than we were.
Right.
Like, for instance, during one invasion, a Spanish island didn't even know they were at war. And I can't remember the fucking island now. I think it was Guam, maybe?
That sounds right.
But the American Navy fired on them, and the Spaniards sent out a boat requesting ammunition because they thought it was simply a salute and they wanted to be able to return it. They had no idea they were at war. So, like...
Oh, fuck. Yeah.
I mean, they had plans for a draft all the way back in 1914 and 15, and it was a limited one. And honestly, it's a much better plan and much better draft than anybody's come up with in American history before or since. So starting in 1915, they wanted to draft 600,000 men a year, but just long enough to be given basic military training and then sent back home to go work their normal jobs and be part of reserve units, with the active federal army only being used to train draftees that came into service. In any case of emergency, the reserve units could be activated. This is literally a much better way of drafting than the U.S. ever used in real life.
Yeah. Well, and then you think about how a lot of drafting ended up getting used, where it was towards the end of World War II, where it was just, all right, you've been in for 60 days and you're in Europe. You fuck.
Yeah. Or like during the Vietnam War, where people would be drafted for like 13 months.
Yeah, like just long enough to get them through boot camp, get them over for a year, and then you get back and you get discharged.
Yeah, it's all very stupid. This system works much better. I'm actually much better at the system than the one that we currently have. Because it would defang the United States military, but it would give us an effective defense force. That's what I want.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's isn't it kind of similar to like what Switzerland does?
I think so, but I don't know enough about this.
That's fair, and I don't want to talk on my ass about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, once the U.S. had finally officially entered the war, they kind of hoped that... so, obviously, that draft program that I just talked about never happened. And when they entered the war, most people were on the side that, okay, we want a volunteer army. We want people to volunteer for active service. And they kind of hoped that the thrill and adventure in wartime service would drive hundreds of thousands of men into the ranks with the ultimate goal of 1 million men in uniform. And to be fair, this worked for a lot of countries, though those countries were in Europe where the idea this war could be in their front door if they didn't win was very real. So in the US, instead of having 1 million men in uniform, within 6 weeks, only about 150,000 people volunteered. Hell yeah. Because remember, the war is not popular.
Yeah, and it's been going on for a couple years at this point, so everyone knows they're not just going to go cover themselves in glory and lead a fantastic cavalry charge, even in the United States.
Yeah, the lies that could be told in France and England in the very beginning, home by Christmas, they're yo, this is gonna suck. Would you like to sign up?
Yeah, you've been reading about are newspaper articles about people just dying in the mud for the last couple of years. Wouldn't you like to do it too? No.
Yeah, these guys have the benefit of opening up a newspaper and reading about the Battle of the Somme and be like, I want no part of this.
Yeah, after the fucking PALS battalions just got the PALS armies got the shit shot out of them. I don't know.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to fucking hey man, you want to go fucking enlist together? Fuck you, asshole.
Yeah, I would take a toe off to escape the trenches for sure.
Oh yeah. Because you're gonna lose it anyway, so I mean fuck it, might as well get it out of the way early.
Yeah. So instead of waiting on this volunteer army, We got the Selective Service Act of 1917. And credit where credit's due, it did fix some of the problems with the last one during the Civil War where you could buy your way out of the draft.
Or hire someone to go for you.
Yeah, you couldn't do that anymore. But along with the draft law came with a massive propaganda campaign to drum up support for the war. Because, like I said, nobody wants to do this shit.
Right.
And with those came the Espionage and Sedition Acts, both passed in 1917. In the House, the laws passed unanimously, with the exception of one nay vote, cast by a guy named Meyer London, who happened to be a member of the Socialist Party from New York. So credit where credit's due. Now, in Congress, some people did vote against it, but he was the only one in the House.
You mean in the Senate?
Yeah, in Senate. Yeah. Sorry. He was the only one in the House who voted against it. Now, while the government had been churning out propaganda, this was the weapon they needed to round out the political repression in order to shut up all these people saying that the war is bad. This gave the government sweeping powers to throw pretty much everyone it didn't like in prison for saying so much as, like, maybe we shouldn't be fighting this war.
Yeah. And, like, you know... and was like very heavily targeted towards like fucking immigrants. And I think actually, if I remember correctly, one of these sedition acts even created the captain of the port role that the Coast Guard has now, which allowed them to like post guards around major shipping areas and like arrest people at like a federal level for it.
Pretty much. Yeah. It was used as like, so it was a weird law. Like, for instance, even speaking out against President Wilson himself would be considered illegal in some cases, and it was very decentralized. The Attorney General left it up to local U.S. attorneys to bring charges as they saw fit. There was no like federal stormtroopers kicking down your door or anything. They left it up to local authorities. Now, the excuse for that was you're a local authority, you'll know who the threat is in your local area. However, this meant that the laws were almost always used to target racial and religious minorities as well as left-wing organizations, especially the Wobblies. Yay! And also a lot of black people and Jews.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much it was just used to, like, you know, as with any of these laws, it was just used as a cudgel to, like, you know, go after, you know, what kind of, you know, enemy of the state or enemy of capital happen to exist in a particular area.
Well, I mean, that's no matter what the reason for whenever political repression tools come out, whether it's this act or the Patriot Acts or whatever, it's the repression always starts on the right and exerts outwards. It's never any other way.
Yeah.
Like, you know, obviously we see this now where it's almost always used against minorities and socialists and anarchists or whatever. But like the Patriot Act was empowered federal authorities to infiltrate just random mosques and sewing and reading circles from like old ladies and shit who maybe like also talked about the war not being good in like Iraq.
Yeah, like Quakers, like the anti-war movement in like 2003, 2004, WTO protesters, ELF, you know, folks who like, you know, and of course, you know, disproportionately, you know, you get prosecutions and you get, you know, you just get like, you know, even just general harassment, you know, folks coming to your house and whatever. Meanwhile, you know, during the same period, you had the rise of the, you know, as Joe knows very well, like the Michigan militia movement and whatever, like during the 90s and into the 2000s. And somehow that's what, you know, which is something that was left primarily unchecked and definitely hasn't come back to bite us in the ass in the course of like the last, you know, 7 or 8 days.
Yeah, the only thing that anybody ever cared about the Michigan militia ever is when Timothy McVeigh got involved, because obviously we know how that ended.
Right. But I don't know. And I mean, like, it's one of those things, too, where that's why, you know, I have to laugh every time that, you know, someone brings up, you know, you know, you can't advocate for this, you know, or you shouldn't laugh at this, you know, these tools of censorship, you know, Trump getting kicked off of Twitter, that'll, you know, that'll get used against the left one day. And it's like, motherfucker, it already does. It already happens.
Every single bit, it always is. And they know that because most people, I mean, the left is generally politically engaged. They're the ones like Eugene Debs constantly going on speaking tours, having meetings, organizing. Normal people don't do that shit. So it won't affect them.
Yeah. Well, and it's just like,
they know this.
And it's one of those things. So like, you know, every time, I mean, I'm not like advocating for like, you know, additional like statues. I think that's fucking dumb. And like, I'm not saying that, you know, the state needs to be provided with more like tools at its disposal to like grind you under its heel. but it's definitely one of those things where if you pretend that like, oh no, like what happens if this is going to get used against the left? It's like it probably whatever you're talking about has probably already been used against the left. So the fact that it is at all ever used against the right is something to like, at least like gain some amount of Schadenfreude joy out of it.
Yeah, and the idea that's like, oh no, we need more statues and more tools. Like weird, only if we didn't already have all these local, state, and federal laws against arming yourself and storming government buildings.
Yeah.
It's weird that we had this blind spot in our legislation that allowed this to happen. Or maybe it's just because people have been screaming for years something was going to happen, and they got fucking ignored.
Well, and it's also like, it's the same reason why, like, if you steal $20 from a liquor store, it's a fucking felony. You go to jail for 5 years. And if you, loot a fucking entire company, saddle it with a bunch of debt, and then sell it and have it go bankrupt, you get like Rotarian of the Year at the local fucking, the award ceremony in December. I mean, it's
like the guy who stole the guy who kicked in Nancy Pelosi's door and stole mail and shit might face like a year in prison. And there was like BLM activists who were facing life in Utah for pouring red paint on somebody's doorstep.
Yeah.
Like, shut the fuck up. Yeah. I don't care.
It's just, I don't know. I mean, just the dumbest fucking shit.
Yeah, let's not pretend that these laws are applied fucking evenly. And also, you know what else happens from time to time when this occurs? Paramilitaries get involved, Shocks. So that happens here too.
Yeah, as it always fucking does, because like the minute you give a little tin pot dictator like an inch of fucking power, they take it.
It's weird. It's almost like when you empower unhinged people who want to enforce the law with their own hands and brutalize their political opponents. That's just what they'll do. And if you feed them enough, they'll blow up in your face. So it wasn't just the government cracking down on everybody and everything who might speak out against the war. The American Defense Society, a right-wing vigilante group, pulled anti-war speakers off soapboxes in New York City and beat them to death. The American Protective League, a national group of 250,000 volunteers acting on the blessings of the U.S. Attorney General Thomas Gregory, kicked open their neighbors' homes and searched their mail and reported allegedly disloyal behavior, many of whom were arrested and thrown in prison.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, it's a dumb aside, but it's one of the few things that I've been able to get any joy out over the course of like being inside for the greater part of the past 10 months. I was occasionally playing Forza. And, just like on an Xbox that I bought just, in particular for that purpose. And one of the things I'm always struck by is the sheer number of motherfuckers who like want to make every single fucking car that you can have in the game into a cop car. Like, it's like a deep fucking sickness when you look at like, I don't know, some fucking Lamborghini or something and like, man, what if I made it into a cop car? Like, what the fuck is wrong with you? How far have you like put that boot down your throat where like you can't like, I don't know, just like enjoy like a dumb car game for what it is. You got to even pretend to be a fucking cop in it.
Have you ever throat fucked a boot so hard the toes come out of your ass?
I mean, if that's your kink, I mean, it's fine. But like, Jesus fucking Christ, like, I mean, it's like the joke they make on Trash Future a bunch about like volunteer fucking border force. I mean, that's what all these fucking assholes are.
Yeah, it's like again, going back to the Capitol, even though I'm trying not to do that, it's like there's 100% chance that there's a blue line flag within 5 feet of a cop being beaten to death.
Yeah.
Like,
or being worn by one of the fucking people who's doing it. Like, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, we're a diseased people, man. Now, kind of like what we talked about during the Iraq War with, whoever part of whatever federal organizations infiltrating reading circles and anti-war groups, regardless of their politics. It also happened here. There were some conservative groups that were targeted, mostly like Quakers and other religious groups. But the anti-war activists ran the gamut from leftists to isolationist conservatives, and they were all targeted. Though most of the Quakers and conservatives did not go to prison. Not so much for the leftists.
Fuck.
In one case, 2,000 war protesters were arrested for the crime of inspiring resistance to military recruitment. One of these was noted socialist speaker Kate Richards O'Hare, who was sentenced to 5 years in prison for giving an anti-war speech in North Dakota. The government also blocked everything it considered anti-war or against the war effort, from actual anti-war leaflets and newspapers, of which there was tons, to a movie about the Revolutionary War because it's made their allies, that being, the British, look bad. Just so fucking stupid. Just for comparison, so we know where the priorities are for the U.S. government. At the same time this is happening, the Supreme Court struck down a law banning child labor.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. No, we're just, just firing on all fucking cylinders. Just like some super like fucking turbocharged capitalist shit.
While most of this is going on, Debs was secluded away in his house in Indiana. Debs was sick. He had a lot of health problems. And he spent his time writing for a lot of the newspapers that would find like his articles being censored out of them, and then those newspapers just getting closed down. This eventually began to piss him off more and more as he realized that the freedom of speech was gone, not to mention expression and one's, airing of grievances with the government. And a lot of his friends were getting arrested. O'Hare was a very close friend of his. So he decided, fuck this. I'm as healthy as I'm going to be. I'm going to hit a speaking tour of the Midwest. He was dealing with like heart failure, and he was just all around a weak dude most of the time.
Can't imagine why. It's not like he was like, working in a rail yard since he was 14 prior to this.
And spending random fits and starts in jail.
Yeah.
And a lot of people worried that it would kill him. And everybody that wasn't worried that the speaking tour would kill him was more worried that he'd almost certainly be arrested. And Debs, to his credit, kind of understood that would happen. He said, quote, "I'll take 2 jumps off and they'll nail me, but that's all right." And though he was a smart dude. He read the acts that he was going to be protesting as closely as he could, and purposefully made speeches that he thought would not run afoul, meaning he would not tell people he wouldn't tell people to burn their draft cards or like tell President Wilson to eat his ass or anything like that. But the law was very unevenly applied. For instance, O'Hare gave the same speech that got arrested in North Dakota in a different state the day before, and nothing bad happened to her. And the same thing kind of happened to Debs. He spoke in Illinois and Indiana with no incident whatsoever. But then he traveled to Canton, Ohio, and like most things in life, the joy had to end when he went to Ohio. He went to a Socialist Party gathering. Ohio people, I had to. I'm contractually obligated to. So he went to a gathering at the Socialist Party building that he knew would be heavily infiltrated by cops, as they pretty much always were. Good thing that doesn't happen anymore. Cops were there in plain clothes and moved through the crowd, demanding to see military-aged males draft cards. And if they did not have them on them, they were hauled away. Now, not having your draft card on your person was not illegal. However, that did allow them to pull them away for questioning.
Cool.
Because that seems illegal, but all...
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and then once again, this is, you don't realize how much a lot of the things that we really take for granted and in our current society are things that were developed relatively recently. Miranda warnings aren't a thing until the 60s. The Fourth Amendment really I don't know, has very little power at this particular juncture. A lot of the shit that we would think is kind of part and parcel of criminal law and criminal procedure are just not a fucking factor.
Yeah, I at this point, I honestly assumed going into this, because again, I'm not an American history major. I think I've made that apparent. But I assumed that child labor had been banned by now. But I was like, holy shit, really?
Yeah, not till the 30s.
17,
Yeah, no, not till the 30s do you start getting really not until FDR do you get any sort of real regulation about anything about employment whatsoever. That's at all favorable to employees.
I think we got maybe 15, 20 years left until somehow actually if you're 12, you can go to work with your parents or something.
Yeah,
if you're 12, you can work for Uber Eats on your bike.
Yeah, that's very solidly Ben Sass and fucking Ted Cruz and shit. Ted Cruz legitimately believes in child labor. So
Truman of character.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, the Canton, Ohio speech is pretty fucking legendary, and I would actually encourage you, and I'll put the link where you could read the entire thing for free in the show notes. And I picked out choice bits. I can't read the whole thing because it's so fucking long, but it's really good. Like I've pointed out before, I'm not much of a theory or a speech guy. However, this speech fucking slaps. I encourage everybody to read it because a lot of it fucking resonates today. So he starts off by saying, 3 of our most loyal comrades are paying the penalty of their devotion to the cause of the working class. They have come to realize that it's extremely dangerous to exercise the constitutional right of free speech in a country fighting to make democracy safe in the world. And everybody laughed. Do not worry over treason to your masters. Be true to yourself, and you cannot be a traitor to any good cause on earth. He was talking about the 3 people. There's something called the workhouse, which is like an old timey word for a jail. Who like was speaking outside of the jail and got arrested the day before. So that's who he was talking about. The master class has always declared the wars. The subject class has always fought the battles. The master class has all to gain and nothing to lose, while the subject class has nothing to gain and all to lose, especially their lives. They have always taught and trained you to believe in your patriotic duty to go to war and have yourself slaughtered in their command. But in all the history of the world, you, the people, have never had a voice in declaring war. And strange it certainly appears that no war of any nation, of any age, has ever been declared by the people. And here let me emphasize the fact, and it cannot be repeated too often, that the working class fight all the battles. The working class make the supreme sacrifices. The working class who freely shed the blood and furnish the corpses have never yet had a voice, either in declaring war or making peace. It is the ruling class that inevitably does both. They alone declare war, and they alone make peace. He also attacked the super rich in America, the robber barons of the age, who encouraged Americans to grow their own food and ration. He said, cultivate war gardens, while at the same time a government war report just issued that shows practically 52% of all arable tillable soil is held out of use by landlords, speculators, and profiteers. They themselves do not cultivate the soil. They could not they would not if they could. These are the gentry who are today wrapped up in the American flag, who shout their claim from the housetops that they are the only patriots and have their magnifying glasses in hand, scanning the country for any evidence of disloyalty, eager to apply the brand of treason to the men who dare to even whisper the opposition to Junker rule in the United States. No wonder Sam Johnson declared that patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrel. He must have had this Wall Street gentry in mind, or at least their prototypes, for in every age it seems to be a tyrant, the oppressor, and the exploiter who has wrapped themselves in the cloak of patriotism or religion, or both to deceive and overawe the people. Good thing that one didn't continue to happen.
Yeah.
Now, Debs purposely went out of his way, like I said, not to attack the president or the war directly, so as not to run afoul of the laws that already claimed several of his friends. He even said as much in the beginning of his speech. Like he's like, comrades, I have to be very careful, otherwise I'll join our friends next door and things like that. And he didn't want to go to prison, though he did understand there's a very real possibility. But unfortunately for Debs, much like thinking he could follow the rules and be treated with respect by his old rail yard bosses, the government wanted to arrest him, so he was fucked before he even set out. President Wilson himself hated Debs and considered him a traitor openly and in notes. So there was no way he was not going to get arrested, which is kind of incredible that like the president of the United States who's fighting an overseas European war at this point is like, you know what, that dude in Indiana minding his own business, fuck that guy.
Yeah, you would think that he would have better fucking things to concentrate on.
It's just like that. What everybody has that one guy who irks them. Like, you know, not only was Debs not racist, he was also anti-war, and
that was just one fucking step too far.
Yeah, like wait, you don't hate black people and you want fair pay and time off? Get the cops.
Yeah.
If the FBI had been invented yet, I'd call them.
If there's anything that will ever get you beaten in America, it's those two things.
Get me yield silver shirts. So, of course, Debs was arrested when he was about to enter his next speaking engagement and charged with 10 counts of violating the Espionage and Sedition Acts. And honestly, I read his speech looking for what 10 counts those could be, and I could not find them.
Yeah.
I don't have, like, my 1900s lawyer glasses on, but, like, I try to read it pretty openly. I don't know. I couldn't find it. But Debs also knew that it didn't matter. At Debs' trial in Cleveland in September of 1918, the prosecutor argued that Debs' speech was, quote, calculated to promote insubordination and propagate obstruction to the draft. Debs' lawyer conceded the facts of the case, and Debs spoke on his own behalf. The main reason for this is Debs knew that there was no point. He knew that there was no chance that he was going to step one single foot in court and be allowed to walk free. So he did not even try. When confronted with his charges, he pretty much just tried to argue the illegitimacy of the acts he was being charged under, which, sure, but it was never going to get him off.
Right.
He said, quote, I have been accused of obstructing the war. I admit it. I abhor war. I had opposed the war if I stood alone. If the espionage law stands, then the Constitution of the United States is dead. He was then, of course, found guilty.
Yeah. I mean, but, it's like, I mean, for all the folks at this point, like, there really was never really very much of any fucking doubt once they, once they arrested you. It just meant that they wanted you in jail.
Yeah, he knew he wasn't gonna go home. And by the way, he's married this whole time. He doesn't have any kids. He just has a very unhappy wife, I assume.
Yeah.
After he was found guilty, Debs said, Your Honor, I have stated this court that I am opposed to the form of our present government, and I'm opposed to the social system in which we live, and I believe in change of both, but in perfectly peaceful and orderly means. I'm thinking this morning that the men in the mills and the factory. I'm thinking of the women who, for a paltry wage, are compelled to work out for their lives, of the lives of the little children who in this system are robbed of their childhood, and their early and tender years are seized by the remorseless grasp of Mammon and forced into the industrial dungeons, there to feed the machines while they themselves are being starved of body and soul. Your Honor, I ask no mercy. I plead for no immunity. I realize, finally, that I am right and I must prevail. I never more fully comprehend now that the great struggle between the powers of greed, on one hand, and upon the rising hosts of freedom. I can see the dawn of a better day of humanity. The people are awakening, and in due course of time, they will come into their own. They don't need me. Unfortunately, he was wrong about that last part. But the judge didn't care and sentenced him to 10 years in prison. And after that, he said his most memorable quote of his entire life. Quote, I listened to all that was said in this court, and I support the justification of this prosecution. But my mind remains unchanged. I look upon the espionage law as a despotic enactment in flagrant conflict with democratic principles of the spirit of free institutions. Your Honor, years ago I recognized my kinship with all living beings, and I have made up my mind that there is not one bit better that I am not one bit better than the meanest man on earth. I say then, I say now, that while there is a lower class, I am in it. And while there's a criminal element, I am of it. And while there's a soul in prison, I will not be free. Yeah, and then he went to prison because unlike movies, when you give a really cool speech, you don't get found innocent, unfortunately, or get given time served.
Well, and then his conviction was, he appealed it, and it was upheld, and it was upheld, and it was upheld by the Supreme Court ultimately, including everyone's favorite, early liberal justice, Oliver Wendell Holmes. Said that, essentially he saw no problem with upholding Debs' conviction.
Yeah. The strangely enough, the one person who seemed to be against it was the U.S. Attorney General, Michael Palmer. Now, because when the war ended, a lot of these political prisoners, they call them prisoners of consciousness, I believe, were commuted. They were let out. Debs was not. Because Woodrow Wilson fucking hated him. For instance, there's numerous requests for clemency, not a pardon. Debs never asked for a pardon. But every bit of clemency was always refused by Wilson, to include a personal plea from the U.S. Attorney General Michael Palmer, who noted that he's very sick and he might die. We can't have a political prisoner die in prison in the United States. It would look terrible. And he sent it to the president, who sent it back with simply the word no written on it.
Fuck.
While Eugene Debs was in prison, he ran for president one more time. Despite not being able to campaign in any fucking way possible, he still won nearly 1 million votes.
Yeah, which I mean, and which I think was around 3% of the vote at that time. Which
I think it was a little bit higher than that.
Yeah. But I mean, which is just amazing to think about. I mean, I'm trying to think of, I don't know. You try to think about other American political figures who've run for shit from prison.
Oh, they go nowhere.
Yeah, well, I mean,
It's not like Northern Ireland where they actually might win a parliamentary seat.
well, I mean, it is kind of like Northern Ireland in that it's also happened in Boston because I'm thinking of James Michael Curley, but that's about the only one that immediately springs to mind.
I'm curious. I'm pretty sure he beat the Green Party results in 2020.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't doubt it. I mean, also, like, even at that point, like, the Socialist Party was, a lot more of a legitimate party than the Green Party probably is now, but that's just my own personal opinion.
No, don't disagree with you. So in 2020, Howie Hawkins of the Green Party won less than 0.5% of the popular vote.
What about in 2016?
Oh, you mean the bugaboo Jill Stein?
Yeah.
Oh boy.
Which, like, everyone always talks about her. No one ever talks about, what's his nuts, the fucking libertarian candidate, Gary Johnson.
She won 1% of the popular vote.
Yeah, so they tripled the percentage.
Though, to her credit, she did win about 400,000 votes more than Eugene Debs from prison. But yeah, eventually, though, Debs did get out of prison, but he had to wait for Woodrow Wilson to leave office. When Warren G. Harding came to office, he commuted Debs' sentence pretty quickly. It was within a few months in 1921. And he invited Eugene Debs to the White House afterwards to meet him personally. And when they met, Harding greeted him with, quote, "I've heard so goddamn much about you. I'm glad to have finally gotten the chance to meet you personally." Though if Debs was overly gracious of Warren Harding, you'd be wrong. He said that he seemed like a good person, but he's still of the master class and therefore a bad person. Like, I'm pretty sure Debs would have been perfectly fine just dying in prison. Right. I mean, when you have the courage of your convictions that fucking deep. Yeah, I mean, he there's a very good reason why he never asked for a pardon. He's like, I'm guilty. Yeah, I did the shit out of that. Yeah, I did those crimes. And even Harding is like, there's no doubt of his guilt. If you asked him, he'd tell you he's guilty. It really seemed like President Wilson wanted to leave him in prison until he died. And he almost got his wish. He died a couple years after he got out at the age of 70. I think it was 1925 or 1924 or something like that. Yeah. So he only made it a couple years after because, like I said, he was very, very sick when he went into prison. And prison, it's terrible now, but it was even worse then and only made him sicker and sicker. And unfortunately, when Debs got out, the Socialist party that he helped build, along with most of the labor unions he helped build, were pretty much dead when he got out. Or at least were being actively persecuted still through the first Red Scare. Yeah, so he spent most of his time in his home in Indiana trying to regain his health, but he died. Unfortunately, this doesn't have a super happy ending because this is from 100 years ago. Of course, the guy died. But yeah, it's really interesting. We've covered, this is the second guy we've covered as far as anti-war people who end up having horrible consequences. First was obviously the White Rose, which, they got beheaded with a fucking guillotine. So I suppose it could be worse. Yeah. But it's also saying Woodrow Wilson, not technically as bad as the Nazis. Cool. Well, and it's also one of the things too that, that's a low fucking bar. But right. It's also just one of the interesting things is, and I feel like it's just because so much about anti-war activism kind of feels like it, just ends up happening almost in a vacuum because you with the exception of kind of the mythologizing of the hippies during the Vietnam War, you don't really hear that much about any other anti-war activism from any other war. You don't hear anything about it during World War II at all. You hear very little about it during World War One. Korea, you don't really hear about any of the anti-nuke activists from the 80s or anything really, or at least you didn't when I was going through school. So it's kind of always interesting to see the way that, particularly with World War One, you kind of learn that America went in reluctantly and then just kind of, won World War One for the good guys, and you never really learned why we were the good guys. You never really learned why, the other side, the other side were the bad. You certainly never learned that anyone ever opposed it for any real reason. So, I obviously my relationship with World War One is much different, especially because my family wasn't in the United States yet. Right. And my I suppose I simply wouldn't exist if the other side had won. But from an American perspective, it's always very weird to me that like I never heard much about this in school, even in college. I only heard about Eugene Debs because of one specific class in college. And yeah, I think, going back to that quote that he said that, the master class wraps himself in the flag, then perches up on high with a magnifying glass looking to stamp anybody's head with traitor. That's what you get. And especially like as a veteran on the left who is also very anti-war, more specifically anti-Iraq and Afghanistan war, the global war on terror, whatever you want to call it. I get that all the time, where you have people who are trying to out-patriot one another, calling themselves patriots. And, I oppose the war that I fought in. Therefore, I'm either a pussy, I didn't actually fight, or I was never even in the military at all. Like, they have to immediately discredit you rather than attempt to disentangle your argument and see why you might be against the war.
Yeah.
And that's kind of that's obviously why you have political repression like the Espionage and Sedition Acts. These people are traitors. You don't have to listen to them. Just shove them into some federal prison where hopefully they'll get consumption and die. And, obviously that doesn't happen so much anymore for the anti-war activists anyway.
But you could even see, even like, in more recent history, if you look at, the kind of the political history of the United States from, the beginning of the global war on terror to, the present day, and for all that we're told that we have to forgive, Democrats in particular who, were for it before they were against it, as, Kerry said when he ran for president in 2004.
Fucking John Kerry, man. He's the pinnacle of die a hero, live long enough to see yourself become the villain.
Yeah. And so like you hear so much about how we have to, forgive everyone who voted for Iraq because they didn't know better somehow as like grown ass adults, like, in Congress, in the early 2000s. But very few people have like, and like we have to, and we have to allow like David French and like Frum and like other fucking dickheads into polite society. But we never really.
We should pool the people who live in Missoula and how they feel about those people still holding government seats.
Yeah. Well, but meanwhile, like if you look at a lot of the folks who opposed the war back then, they've mostly been sidelined. So and you even with one of my own personal pet peeves with and I know why people do it, and I get it, of criticizing Trump for being like a putative war hawk, but then also at the same time like dodging the draft back in the day. And like dodging
the draft is the most humane thing or most human action I've ever seen him do.
Yeah, and also you don't want to accidentally back into making military service a fucking litmus test for whether or not you get to participate in society, which is like you're kind of ceding so much ground by making those sorts of attacks. That it becoming fucking Robert Heinlein to own the conservatives. Yeah, like it's like such a fucking bad look, and you just like everyone needs to fucking stop it. It doesn't. The other side doesn't matter if you point out hypocrisy, and all you're doing is help introduce this idea that you have to like be this fucking you have to be like a that having the new person of color head of Raytheon is like the kind of liberation that you want to see in the world, and it's just such a poor fucking look.
Yeah, I'd love to slap a Black Lives Matter sticker on my Predator drone. So we can change the topic and end this on something of hopefully lighter note. Maybe not. Shocks, we do something on the show called Question from the Legion. If you'd like to ask us a question from the Legion, you can donate $1 to the show, get access to our Discord, Patreon, and then just slide into my DMs or email me or whatever. Put a message in a bottle, float it towards Hawaii. If I get it, I will ask your question on air. Messenger pigeons, also fine. Today's question is, what is your favorite conspiracy theory? Not necessarily one that you believe, but what is your favorite?
I don't know. I'm trying to remember someone on fucking, I think it was Dwight, maybe on Twitter, had like a good thing recently that was some of my favorite conspiracy theories. It was like, what's your favorite one? Or like what, that's what it was. It was, if you could know the truth about a conspiracy theory, which one would you pick? Which I guess is kind of similar. And
That's a good one.
I chose, because I am who I am, I chose Hoffa.
Hoffa's a good one.
But for
I also have a Hoffa one.
Yeah. I would definitely like Hoffa would be definitely kind of cool. And, like some of, my favorite conspiracy theory about that, about like all the, he's buried under a fucking farm somewhere, or like that he got spirited away entirely and has been living in witness protection for this long.
He'd be like 100 years old, wouldn't he?
Yeah, he'd probably be dead by now. I just mean like, like when I first started reading about that. But I would say my other general favorite conspiracy theories are like each and every single one about that involves the Bermuda Triangle, like the fucking trainer flight off of Florida that disappeared. Like all the fucking, like ghost ships and whatever else that just disappeared in the, Bermuda Triangle. It's definitely a little bit disappointing when you read about them now and you're like, they don't know what happened. And then you read that it was like a 50-year-old, like coal ship that was like bending in half every single fucking journey. And you're like, pretty sure I know what happened there. I'm pretty sure it just fucking sank. But, yeah, like any sort of like alien abduction shit or just like, portal to a different land or whatever shit that involves the Bermuda Triangle, I'm here for.
That one's solid. I guess since we've brought it up, I'll do the Hoffa one, and mine has a personal connection since my stepdad was UAW forever until he retired. But one of the jobs that he had for the UAW, which is the United Auto Workers Union for nobody, for someone not from the Midwest who doesn't know what that is, when he was a kid, which is forever ago for him because he's like 70 now. One of the jobs that he had was crushing cars. And then after crushing the cars, they'd put them in an incinerator, which they would leave nothing left. And, back in the day, Detroit mobs pretty much controlled the UAW and therefore controlled most auto worker factories. And he firmly believed, because like one of the things that he was told is when they brought a car in, you're not allowed to go through it. Because like they're afraid that these like kids are going to steal shit from him. Because he was like 19 or whatever, 19 or 20.
Yeah.
He's afraid they're going to part out this car or whatever and make the company look. He's like, you can't go through it. Don't open the trunks. Don't do shit. Just put it in the crusher. Burn the cube. So he was like, there's a 50% chance I burn Jimmy Hoffa and I have no idea. So it's like, stepdad killed Jimmy Hoffa. I'm on it.
Yeah, like I back that.
100%.
It's not a conspiracy theory, but I'll leave with a very Boston conspiracy anecdote, which is I worked at the Apple store on Boylston Street for like a couple years back when I was an undergrad, and one of the cashiers there told me once that she had been working at the candy store that used to be on Newbury Street, and she said that at one point when she was working there, she looked across the street and swears to the hand of God that she saw Whitey Bulger sitting in a parked car right on Newbury Street, and he was just like looking straight at her. And to her telling, he just put his finger to his lips, making the shush notion, and then or motion, and then drove right off. And so she swears that she saw Jimmy Hoffa that one day, or not Whitey Bulger, and. And so I back the conspiracy theory because I back all personal conspiracy theories. Kind of like my grandmother saying that my great-grandfather ran booze for the Kennedys back during Prohibition.
That'd be rad. Wasn't Whitey Bulger being protected by an FBI agent?
Oh, yeah. That's well documented. He was being protected by John Connolly, and John Connolly actually went to fucking jail for it. Because you literally have to like aid and abet a fucking serial killing mob boss for like decades in order to go to jail as an FBI agent in this country.
Yeah, all of that just so he could like hang on the coast, get arrested, and then get beaten to death by a lock and a sock by another mobster in prison.
Yeah, well, because of course that's the whole thing was was Jimmy or was Whitey Bulger a snitch for the FBI, or was the FBI a snitch for Whitey Bulger? And that's the thing that depending on what side you believe, no one's ever been able to figure out.
The FBI is just Whitey Bulgers all the way down.
Yep.
Shocks, thanks for joining me in lieu of Nick. The Boston Nick.
The Boston Cryptid. That's what I'm going by now.
And until next time, don't get arrested.
Do oppose war.
Do oppose war. Don't get arrested.
There we go.